Hey there, welcome to the archives. So this one is called Pay Attention to How People Shame You. And so when I was doing my PhD, I used critical discourse analysis and autoethnography as methods, which in a way is a lot of cultural studies and ethnography. Studying myself in relation to my cultures meant that I was basically doing a lot of observations, watching not only myself but others, paying close attention to different trends, different patterns, different cycles and repetition, which I already um, tend to be obsessed with. And so I'm seeing a lot of the same trends that I saw then, I'm seeing now come up both in myself as well as in others in popular culture, like some of the shows and stuff that I've been watching. Um, and so one of the trends I wanted to note and to focus attention to on this one is shame others how we shame others says a lot about what we ourselves are ashamed of, right? Or said differently, basically, how others shame us has a lot to do with what they perceive as shameful. It's important to note here that this might align, right? What they perceive as shameful might align with what we perceive as shameful. And so I want to note that, right? But it's not always the case. That's not always the case. So one trend is that when someone is looking to clap back, hit below the belt, insult somebody, um, especially when they're doing it intentionally to hurt them, what we often will find is that they will reach into things that would hurt them the most, right? It's really a projection at the end of the day because it's their attempt, like the attempt in hurting us. In order to figure out what hurts somebody else, you have to lean on your own intelligence system, right? You're basing that based on your own history, your lived experiences. That's what's informing your perception of what you think might hurt another person, right? This hurt me in the past, or I've seen this hurt other people in the past, and so I think this is also going to hurt you, and I'm going to use this in this moment um, to hurt you. And so, for instance, this is not always the most rational thing because just something that might be really hurtful to us if we were ever called it, or something that we're afraid to become or to be seen as, that might not necessarily affect somebody in that same way. They might not care. Um, but because we think that it's the worst insult, it's the worst offense, whatever, that it's going to land the same way. And it doesn't always land the same way. Um, and this, you would think that that's rational, right? If you really want to hurt somebody, you're really going to hit them where it hurts. But that's not always the case, especially with emotions, when we've been told to separate ration from emotions. And so we think, like, we just start operating for our emotional body. This would really hurt me. I'm going to assume this is also going to hurt you, when they might not care either way. So an example of this is when someone pay attention to people who shame other people for being fat, for instance. They're usually coming from two places. Either they're obsessed with not being fat themselves, they've never been fat a day in their lives, or they have been fat and they have that same experience, or they are actually fat themselves and it's easier to knock somebody down a peg to not feel so fat. So the first one is usually like the gym obsessed, um, gym rat. They're obsessed with not being fat. Their identity is to not be fat. Being thin, being skinny, being muscular, being healthy, clean eating. This is what they really value, right? Either because they were once fat and they were shamed for being fat, and so they've retained that trauma, and being called fat for them would be the worst offense. Um, these are usually, again, like I said, the gym rats, right? They're diet obsessed people, the calorie counters. They step on scales daily. They pay really a lot of attention to the latest health trends. And none of these activities are in and of itself bad, right? This is not a judgment. I was a varsity rugby player at one time. And so going to the gym daily, multiple times a day, that was my lifestyle. Um, I have been that gym rat. I've had gym memberships. I probably still would if I was able to afford it. I actually enjoy going to the gym. My preference would be to have a home gym so that I don't have to physically go to the gym. But I actually don't mind that. I've used apps to count calories. I've been obsessed with stepping on the scale. I still push myself on some days to do insanity or trap cardio or to go for a walk even when I don't feel like it. So there's nothing wrong with clean eating, maintaining a healthy lifestyle, and being obsessed with any of these things. That's not to shame anybody that's into it. Where it gets tricky is what happens when that fear of getting fat, which other people call fat phobia, right? A phobia is a fear of something. When you have that fear of getting fat and fear of fat people, when that gets projected onto others in an attempt to shame them, to insult them, that's where it gets a little tricky, right? It's one thing to be confident and to love your body and to do the best to maintain a certain weight, a certain healthy lifestyle. But it no longer is a matter of confidence. It's almost you're running into insecurity now if you have to attack people for their weight. That shows more that you're not completely comfortable with all of who you are. If to feel bigger and better about yourself, you need to attack somebody else, right? These are the people, for people who are terrified of getting fat, for them, fatness is the worst thing in their eyes, right? Calling you fat is them essentially showing you that what they perceive to be shameful. This is what they would find most shameful. If somebody called them fat, they would be very offended in that. They work very hard to not ever be seen as fat. That is an insult that you were not going to insult me and call me fat because I know I'm not fat because I work very hard to not be fat. So to call them fat would really bother them, right? They are the types who would be mortified if they gained weight. They are the ones who are disappointed in themselves if they miss a workout or if they cheat more than they like, right? Like me, they have negative self-talk when they are bloated or they've eaten too much. This is a lot of their own internal dialogue is what we're seeing projected outwardly. They're showing us a peep into their internal lives, into their own self-talk, when what we see is them insulting others for being fat. Again, I've been there. That's a lot of my own internalized stuff, projecting it on others who were fat. Being like, I can't believe that so-and-so ex-fat woman is dating somebody. Wow, I'm still single and she can get a man at that weight. Those little really passive, they're not even passive aggressive, they're just outright aggressive comments that we make about people, the judgments and the assumptions we make about people who are in fat bodies. The assumption that they don't deserve to be happy, that no one could possibly love them for who they are. That really says a lot about our own insecurities than has anything to do with them. Oftentimes we don't even know these people, right? They might be strangers on the internet or in person, but something about seeing them happy in their skin, carefree, being loved on, doted on, loving themselves, that's really agitating. If you're a person who would be very uncomfortable with being fat, if being fat would really make you ashamed, if you really fear getting fat because you think that your partner would not love you as a fat person, it's very uncomfortable to see fat people being loved on. Because you're going out of your way to make sure that you're skinny. And again, that's not a bad thing. But when you see somebody's not trying to look like that, when you see that they don't need to be at the gym 4 hours a day, that they don't have to drink smoothies, when they're not engaging in any of these cultural scripts to be skinny or to be healthy and they're still happy, they're still paid, they're still flourishing, they're still loved on, that's really agitating. And so you're going to want to shame them for being fat some more because that's how shame works. Shame is often used as a control dynamics. If I call you fat, my hopes are it will hurt your feelings so bad that you are going to want to take yourself to the gym, and now you and I are both miserable. We're both trying our best to be skinny. Aha, I got you. You're going to conform to thinness because this is what we think, this is what we've all been taught is the ideal. Again, on the other hand, there are actual people who are still fat, and for similar reasons that they've been so shamed that now that holds on to that painful experience of being fat shamed, right? And say they know or they think that hitting below the belt with somebody else who is fat, the person might even be fatter than they are, um, or even thinner than they are. It doesn't matter. It's just that perception that I know what it's like to be called fat and that hurts my feelings, and I'm going to use that word fat to now hurt your feelings. It often says a lot about ourselves. And more times, these people might not even care. They might actually enjoy being fat. They might call themselves fat, right? That's not their insecurity. That's not something that they would be offended by. But we think that they should be offended by it, and so we call them fat. And it has nothing to do with whether it's landing as an insult for them or not. It's just we perceive it as that. Same thing with people who judge and shame others for being ugly. Again, I'm not above any of this, right? I've definitely called people ugly. I still critique myself as ugly sometimes, but this is what I'm trying to say, is that is something that well, in the past more so than now, but that would hurt me. And so to me, that would be a really bad insult. To others, that might be a really bad insult. Being called ugly is like really hurtful for them. And so they will use that to somebody else thinking that it's also hurtful for them, right? These type of people, they place value on body image. They don't want to be viewed as ugly, right? And ugly here is not in like the Mia Mingus kind of a reframe of ugly as something that is positive, as something that is good, as something that should be reclaimed. Ugly here is not from this critical lens of like we need to really reconceptualize what it's called ugly and why ugly is called that. Like that's not. I'm coming from the basic level of people weaponize this idea of ugly, which often is very racist, which often is very ableist. It assumes it's often very fat phobic, like just that basic awful. When you think of ugly, right? When people call other people ugly, they believe that it will hurt their feelings. That's usually saying a lot about how they would react if they were called ugly, right? To them, being called ugly is the worst offense. And so that then becomes the worst insult that they can use on somebody. Doesn't actually, the person might not even be ugly, however we consider ugly. They might be ugly and not care to be beautiful, right? They might challenge this whole notion of ugly and they don't care. Maybe being ugly is their politic, right? Again, going back to me and Mingus's work or the article that I read. But we might think that ugly would be the worst thing in the world. And so now we're going to call somebody else ugly because we think that they too will feel that same level of like burn. And meanwhile, they don't care. Same thing with rich people shaming people for being poor or broke, right? To call somebody who is rich poor, that might be a really bad offense to them because they are not poor. They've worked very hard their whole lives to never be poor, right? Wealth, status, having money, those things are what they place value on. That is important to them, right? That is what matters to them. They would be offended if you called them poor, or they might not be offended, but if somebody who had in that same ballpark, right, of wealth was showing that they bought a new house or that, like that whole keeping up with the Joneses, it's because we value that. Wealth is something that we value. And if anybody came at me in that way, I would be really offended. And so now I'm going to come at you in that way because I think that you should be offended, right? We find the same dynamics of people who are value intelligence or book smarts, right? I am one of these people. If you place value on being smart or being intelligent, being well-read, if this is typically how you will shame others, right? For not being as smart, You will use ableist terms like stupid or dumb. It might really bother you if somebody called you out on your intelligence. I hate to have my intelligence insulted, right? And so thinking that might be where I go to shame people, would be to shame their intelligence, because I don't like when my intelligence is insulted. Academics often get into a lot of this, right? We shame people in this way. Oh, you haven't read this person. You don't know who so and so is. You don't know what this theory is. It's like we shame people for not being as smart, quote unquote. And this often has a lot to do with what we think is shameful, right? We would be ashamed if a student asked us a question and we didn't know the answer. That would make us look like less intelligent. So those type of people, being called or being having their intelligence insulted, is actually what is very shameful for them, right? It not doesn't necessarily say anything about the people that they're insulting. It says a lot more about where they are in that moment. Um, Lots of different example. If you grew up being shamed for being single, unwed, not married, not having children, if in your eyes that is the most shameful, being single is the most shameful, is the most tragic, that's usually where you're going to shame other people when you want to insult them, right? Because to you that is like the worst thing ever. If you rush to get married, to be picked, to be chosen, if that's where a lot of your insecurities are, and I've been this person, right? Where like I will really get down on myself sometimes for being single for so long, for not being chosen, blah, 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 woe is me. Then if I got coupled up, that might be where I'm shaming somebody. Oh, you're still single? You don't have kids in your 40s? Bad, 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 right? Like that becomes where I'm going to shame somebody because I perceive that as the most shameful for me. I felt that is the most shameful for me. Not necessarily that this person even cares to have kids. They might actually not want to ever get married. But we think that in shaming them in this way is going to get them to change their mind. It's going to make them feel really bad. They're going to be jealous of our lifestyle, that we're married. They're going to be envious that we're married and they're not. Like we create all of these stories that might not even be true or real, right? And that's all based on where we are thinking that this is important to us. Again, same thing for folks who call other people lazy, for instance, right? If you work very hard to be seen as hardworking, if you are hardworking, if you would be ashamed for someone to call you lazy, if it would bother you for people to not see you as hardworking, that becomes an insult that you would really be upset by. And so now you're likely going to call somebody else lazy, because to you being called lazy is like the worst offense. And so that's where you think you're hitting low with somebody. That's where you think you're really insulting somebody. Like that's your gotcha, right? Calling them lazy. Meanwhile, they probably are part of like the Nat Bishop's ministry. They love living a soft, easy, carefree, moving, slow life, right? Retiring early is like their life goals. They have no desire or motivation to be like hardworking in the same way as you are. But because your assumption is based on what your history is, your lived experience, being lazy is like the worst thing ever. Especially if you grew up in the church, learned different things around like being a sloth, being, idle. It makes sense that you're going to shame somebody for being lazy if you want to hurt their feelings, because to you that would hurt your feelings. Laziness becomes your arsenal of choice. Another example would be people in spiritual communities that are shaming others for not being as healed, as positive, as happy, or as self-aware. Again, I fall under this category, right? Because if you pay attention to where I shame, this is typically where I will shame people. That or the intelligence one. These are the categories I fall under. Why? Because these are the categories that matter to me. Right? Somebody who values body image might not be offended if you call them unintelligent because they don't care to be smart in your eyes. That doesn't matter to them. You can call them any X amount of ableist terms. It doesn't matter. Looking good to them is what matters. Being in the gym is what matters. Calling them fat might be what actually insults them more than calling them uneducated or unhealed. They don't care to be healed. They don't care. They're not into that spiritual movement. They're not trying. They don't care to get to heaven in the same way. That's not what matters to them, right? But if this is what matters to you, then that's where you're going to shame other people. The shaming around SZA for not being healed, for instance, I found that really bothered me because I saw an element of myself in those people, right? I am the type that would really put my nose up and look down at other people's for not being as healed as I am. Meanwhile, I'm still not completely healed myself, right? They become a mirror for me. And so that might be where I go to shame people, because that would bring me shame. And I had an experience of this recently. I wrote this blog and then I paid attention to something where I felt shamed, and it was in this area, right? It was like, oh, well, you don't know how to do this as good as me. And that did shame me, because this is an area where it matters to me to be seen as spiritual, to have people think that I'm working on my healing. All of these perceptions, all of these egoic traps we get into, that really does lead into where and how we get shamed and or shame, right? I place an emphasis on evolving, on introspection, on internal work. Then I might shame, and I did that recently with a member in my family. I was like, well, you're not the most self-aware. That's how I was shaming them. Why? Because they probably don't care to be self-aware. They care to be rich. They care for their reputation. They care for respect. Being self-aware is not an insult to them. They don't care to be self-aware. But to me, that was how I insulted them, because I think that would be a really huge insult for someone to call me self-aware. That might actually hurt my feelings. But it might not. I might shame somebody for being self-aware, for not being self-aware, sorry, and they might not care. Same with fatness. Like, all of this that's what the message is what we think is important to us is how we are likely going to shame other people, because we think that they automatically must be like us, right? This is why it's really important to not take things personally. This is why it's important to understand that how people shame us is literally not about us. It's almost always them reaching for an insult that they think will hurt them most, right? Which is almost always based off of what they would perceive as shameful for them, right? Now that I've said the areas in which I get shamed, all I could do is work on these areas for myself. I have to not shame myself for not being intelligent at times. I have to not be hard on myself if I haven't read certain things. I have to be okay if I was to teach again, to have a student ask me something and be like, I don't know. And that's okay to not know. I have to be okay with understanding that healing is on a spectrum. It's a journey, not a destination. And people will always be more healed, be more intelligent, be more spiritual, be prettier, be thinner, be this, be that than me. When I start to heal on work on my own shame, how people shame me is not going to have the same impact. I might not have my feelings be as hurt, because that's not something I'm ashamed of anymore. Yeah, maybe a couple years ago when you called me fat, that really hurt my feelings. But you know what? I've done a lot of work to be okay with being fat, or I've worked on losing some weight, or I've gained more weight, and I don't care if you call me fat anymore, right? But also, healing shame is a two-way street, because you're not going to necessarily shame somebody in in a particular way, because that's not like why. When you're healed, when you're okay with your body, when you're okay with your wealth, when you're okay with your money, when you're okay with how your body looks, when you're more secure with yourself, like, you don't necessarily need to shame anybody to prove anything to yourself, because you're not, like, it's not a competition with them. You don't need to take power away from them in that same way. You feel like you have that power within yourself. You're comfortable about that within yourself. You don't need to do all of that stuff to shame somebody else, because you're okay with yourself. Healing becomes a win-win in that situation, right? You no longer need to insult anybody personally because you've worked on that shame, right? They can no longer use it against you because you've worked on that shame. And so that's what I wanted to talk about this way. Layla Delia talks about staying in your equanimity, right? When you do that work on shame, it allows you to be able to stay more into your equanimity because you're not easily rocked in the same way, right? You don't need to engage in that control dynamics, which a lot of shame is about. You don't care to have anybody go lose weight because it's none of your business. You're not trying to shame anybody into getting married because you're happy in your marriage, and what other people are doing that means nothing to you. You're happy with your kids because that's your lifestyle, and if somebody chooses not to, that's none of your business. It doesn't bother you one way or the other. You're not weaponizing these things against other people because you're comfortable with it. You're okay with it. If people were to shame you, it bounces off of you because your skin is much thicker, and you know that's not something that actually shames me anymore. I'm not giving you that power. It doesn't hurt me anymore, right? But thank you so much for trying. And so next time someone shames you, pause, right? Pause to consider how it is that if they were called that same name, would they like it? Because likely it would probably really offend them, right? It's way more fun to psychoanalyze them than it is to take offense to any of their shaming. And so that's what I wanted to talk about in this episode. Until next time, in solidarity.